In this video, we will continue covering chapter 8.4 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. In this book, we will focus on this tutorial to show how to use dynamic projection. Dynamic projection allows us to specify which class needs to be returned from a finder method. That way, you can have a single finder method that returns either entity, interface-based projection, or class-based projection. So this is how our application will look like. We will have a single person entity, and then we will have a person projection interface, which will be used for interface-based projection, and then we have a person DTO, which will be used for class-based projection. So the main focus on this tutorial is declaring finder method of a repository in such a way that finder method can return different classes. And what a finder method should return is specified by this second parameter. So if we take a quick look at our controller, we will have three different endpoints, and each endpoint will call find method in a way that it expects a different type of return value. So this endpoint will expect that finder method returns a person entity, and this will be defined by this second parameter to define finder method like this. Now this endpoint expects that finder method returns person projection, which is a interface-based projection, and this is defined by this second parameter of the finder method. And the third endpoint expects that finder method returns person DTO or class-based projection, which is defined by this second parameter. So this shows how finder method can be told which type to return by specifying the class that should be returned as a second parameter as defined here in our repository. That second parameter defines the type of the class that should be returned. Just like in the previous tutorials, we will have a person entity which will have following properties, and a custom constructor which will allow us to more easily insert instances of person entity into database inside load persons Java class. This class implements command line runner, which means that will be executed as soon as application starts. So inside its run method, following person entities will be inserted into the database. Then we will have a interface-based projection. So this will be our interface in which we will define following two getters, get name and get aged. And Hibernate will use when we expect a finder method to return this instance of a class that implements this interface. Then Hibernate will construct SQL that only retrieves these properties from our entity. And person DTO will be used to implement class-based projection. So the input parameters into this custom constructor tell the Hibernate which properties need to be retrieved from the database from the entity properties. And this is how we can declare our finder method when we want it to be able to return different classes. We have already covered the controller with these three endpoints that call finder method by expecting different type of output every time. And the type of output that is expected is defined by this second parameter. So we can now test our application by using Google Chrome web browser and entering the URL of the first endpoint, which will return a person entity. So this is this endpoint, and as we can see, we are calling finder method in a such way that we expect it to return a person entity, which it does, and then the endpoint returns this person entity and displays its properties in a JSON form, displaying ID, name, and age properties, which are the properties defined in our person entity. We can then call this URL to call our second endpoint, and this second endpoint will return interface-based projection as defined by this second parameter when calling finder method. So it will return an instance of our projection interface, and it will only have name and age properties because our interface-based projection only has these two getters for name and age. So this is why an instance of this interface will only have name and age, and it will not have an ID. And we can now use this URL to call our last third endpoint, which will return a person DTO that only has these two properties. So this is our last endpoint. It expects finder method to return a person DTO as defined by this second parameter, and then the finder method will return person DTO. And we have defined person DTO to have this constructor, and since constructor has only these two properties, these are the properties that will be fetched from the found entity, and therefore, and then loaded here, and therefore when the endpoint returns person DTO, we will have a JSON string with only name and age and without the ID. And if we look at the console, we can see which SQL statement was executed for each endpoint. So for the first endpoint, where we are expecting a person entity, SQL statement will retrieve all the properties of the entity, ID, age, and name. In the second endpoint, which returns a interface-based projection, SQL statement only retrieves name and age properties as defined by the getters inside the interface projection, and the third endpoint, when the third endpoint is called, finder method will execute SQL statement that also only retrieves name and age properties as defined by the input parameters in the person DTO constructor.